Okay, so they probably don't need an introduction, but just in case, I will do so. So David Yip is probably best known for his role as Detective Sergeant John Ho in The Chinese Detective, but you may also have seen him in feature films such as Spielberg's Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, and James Bond's movie A View to a Kill. More recently, he's always worked in theatre, and his most recent play that he's been in is The Bomb, which has been showing at the Tricycle Theatre. Lucy Sheen is an award-winning actress and one of the first British Chinese actresses to appear in a Shakespeare production in 1987. You've probably seen her in things like Lovejoy and EastEnders, and more recently she's also been in the TV comedy Nighty Night Series 2, and also on stage in Tim Luscombe's play Hungry Ghosts, and for that she was nominated for an Off-West End Theatre Award. So thank you so much for coming and joining us to speak about the film today. As I introduce the film, you know, this is the first British-Chinese film made by a British-Chinese director and discussing British-Chinese experiences. So I thought that perhaps we could begin by, you know, thinking about the kind of impact that that film had at that time. And perhaps you could begin by saying something about how important it was for both of you and how significant it was in terms of your career at the time. And this being sort of the 1980s, when, you know, there was a great sort of shift in Britain in terms of racial politics, and there was kind of movement of the beginnings of South Asian and black independent filmmaking at the same time as this kind of British-Chinese groundswell.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to understand very much the tempo of the time, the temperature of the time. I left drama school in 1973, and I deliberately did a lot of theatre first, because basically opportunities in television and film were, and I also, because I don't speak Chinese, were very remote, unless you were playing these very stereotypical parts, and they tended to be gangsters, whores, you know, or whatever. In the beginning of the 1980s, for those of you who are not old enough, I did a series for the BBC which was quite groundbreaking in its way, called The Chinese Detective, and it did what it said on the tin. It was about a Chinese detective. Well, he was British Chinese, and the great thing about that was it's set in the East End of London, which is now Canary Wharf and all up around there. But this character was the first time you actually just saw, I think, a Chinese person, British Chinese person on screen who did just normal things. And the one thing we did determine was that this character was never going to do any kind of martial arts. Basically, if they were too big and ugly and they were coming at him, he'd run. But he had a brain, so he'd stand behind the corner and hit them with a brick or something. But basically you saw his family, and actually Robert, who you saw playing the old man there, he played my father in the series. So that was groundbreaking in itself. But the period it was, because there was nothing apart from that. What Chinese Detective counterbalanced was what's the name of that series for America? Number One Son, Number Three.
Charlie Chan.
Charlie Chan. Yeah. Charlie Chan. So when for me, that was Chinese Detective was an incredible part to play. So, but in terms of film, there was nothing else around. There were no writers, unlike the Afro-Caribbean communities, and by then not so much even the Asian community. But when Ping Pong came along, it was incredible, because there was Po-Chi Leong, who I didn't know. I think it was your first job, wasn't it? It was. Your first job. And when I first was given the script to read, I just was so excited, because there for the first time was something that you could. It's also explained to me part of my culture, because from being British Chinese, I understood the other side of it more, and it was a very interesting part to play. The scope of it was very ambitious, because it demanded a lot of actors actually from the community, and we didn't have a lot of actors, quite honestly. You know, 20 years on, you could make that film quite happily now, but at the time there were very, very few really good actors, and quite a lot. And we'll go on to talk about how Po-Chi had this influence on a big cast, because, and I've noticed very much in my career how quite often I'd be the only person from the British Chinese community who had a part, as it were, but there'd be a lot of extras, and the way they were treated basically as cattle, as most extras were in those days. But you know, they weren't looked upon as being in any way worthy or being able to contribute. And one of the fascinating things for me about the whole production, apart from was that actually the way Po-Chi got performances out of a lot of people who I knew just as extras. They weren't actors, and I've seen them do very bad things in very bad film, but very bad television things. And yet, the way when he spoke to them, the atmosphere on set, the whole feeling was so different from anything else, and everyone had a great feeling, I felt, of we were doing something special. And so he got performances out of people which I found extraordinary. I'll shut up now, you have to say something.
I mean, for me, as David pointed out, I graduated from drama school in 1985. So actually having this script, I mean, I was spoilt in that it was basically the first professional piece that was put in front of me as a possibility. It was so groundbreaking in the fact that the General Secretary of Equity went to bat for me because I didn't have an equity card. It was a closed shop. In order to work, you needed to have an equity card. In order to get an equity card, you had to work. So that was the dilemma. Because I'd trained at a recognised adult drama school here, they thought there was a case for me because I was offered the role to actually be put forward and given one of these sort of golden tickets. In terms of my career, it defined more readily what I was not then offered, which is what I term as kind of like the general sort of Chinese takeaway roles. So it put me in a really wonderful position of actually, for a short period, being able to go to castings and indeed getting theatre jobs and other bits of telly which were, I would classify as non-specified roles. So I was being seen for stuff that a lot of other actors maybe take for granted, that it didn't matter, that my ethnicity wasn't a marker as to whether I should be seen or not. I was basically spoilt, and even though in some senses, looking back on it, I was kind of like shoved in at the deep end, if it hadn't been for people like David and indeed, as he mentioned, the atmosphere on set, I mean, I could have just sunk and they could have recast. But I didn't, thankfully. And I learnt more than you can do in a drama school, I mean, you know, by actually watching and just doing. So from that point of view, for me, it was, you know, I couldn't have asked for a better start. What happened after that then is kind of like quite strange in terms of the overall sort of availability of roles for sort of British Chinese people. I mean, I think it's, in my sort of experience, there was that short window of expansion and real possibilities, and then for some reason you come to the 90s and it all seemed to stop, which is quite strange, kind of like, you know, sort of suddenly ground to a halt, which was very puzzling and actually very sad.
Did you also find that, David, that there was a kind of a sea change around the 1990s?
Did I find a sea change? I find it, and this is, I mean, it's because I've gone from every genre of my profession. I work in everything. I prefer theatre because it's an actor's medium, but obviously film and television is where you earn your living. I would say, actually, quite honestly, as I started in 1970, there were more opportunities in the theatre as a performer, not as a Chinese actor, British Chinese actor, just as an actor. There were more opportunities because there were more theatres. Every major city in this country had a repertory company. I'd say, I suppose by the 90s, mid-90s, yeah, I think it got worse because the theatres closed as the economy dropped. Certainly even up to today, you know, we're in the age of multi-channel television. I remember the first time I went to America and saw multi-channels and spent like half an hour going through them all and realising actually of these 100 channels, only 2 were worth watching. 4 of them, at least 40 of them, were trying to sell God in one way or the other, and they just repeated themselves. So basically it was rubbish, and what everyone said would happen has happened here now. You can turn your television on and see 100 channels, but actually again there's only 2 or 3 worth watching. And actually what that's done is dilute the quality and the work available. And certainly from my opinion, from work with the British Chinese, from from our point of view, has got narrower and narrower and narrower, and even the opportunities for young writers or for writers and directors and actors. I mean, one thing you would have thought would have happened from Ping Pong, because we took it to Venice Film Festival, we took it to Birmingham Film Festival. It went round. It got amazing reviews. Actually, I read them the other day, last night, because I've been asked to talk about this, and I haven't seen the film. We haven't seen the film for about 13, 15 years. I saw too much of it early on, but I haven't seen it, so that's interesting. But the interesting thing was I read some of the reviews, and there were some very powerful people, Dilys Powell, Alexandra Walker, who really rated this film. Now, to be quite honest with you, the film is very flawed. I mean, Po-Chi did amazing things with, as I say, with this huge cast, which I would say, with great respect to them, 90% of them had never really acted before. But even so, because of that, there was still a flaw, because he had so many strands to the story that when it came to the editing it, when he actually looked at the final edit, actually some of the scenes just didn't work. And he was forced to cut in a very odd way, and I think the actual film suffered from that. But that doesn't take away from its importance and the historic importance. And just as Lucy pointed out, you know, Lucy was this young actress who came and had a major role. Now, if that had happened to a white actress in a different movie, she would have gone on in a different way. I was reasonably well known at the time, and it didn't really change my career pattern. It was a nice credit to have. But it didn't open all the doors, as Chinese Detective didn't. Because there's an interesting example. When I did the Chinese Detective, and I did 2 series of it, and everything's on film in these days, I couldn't work in independent television for nearly 6 years, because I'd go for castings and they'd say, "Oh, well, you're the Chinese Detective," and yet all these other actors who appeared in ITV television series were working for the BBC. It was very odd. It was a very strange thing. So with the reviews it got, I don't know how it did in America. Actually, I don't know how it did in.
I think it did reasonably well. But actually, when it was finally sold.
Yeah. So I don't know. And then Po-Chi, you know, I'd like to talk a bit more about Po-Chi because just recently I've become a writer, and I've had a stage play, which I know Diana's going to talk about later. And it was I was asked a question. Andy Willis, who was going to be here today, he spoke to me last week about Po-Chi, so we had a conversation. And it was only during that conversation I suddenly realised, actually, because I wasn't a writer then, that so much of Po-Chi is in this film. So much, because I play him, basically. You know, I play him. I play this guy who was brought up, went to this smart school, was rich, and was Chinese, a banana, as Po-Chi used to say, I'm a banana, you know, yellow on the outside, white on the inside. And at that time, and I can see now, because of my own experience of putting my own life into a piece, how much more of Po-Chi was in there that I didn't realize as an actor at the time. I mean, it was still great parts to play, and I'm sure if you actually took the script and laid it out and actually went through it piece by piece, I think you'd find it very difficult to match even today a script which covers the same sort of ground in the same sort of depth. As I say, it has its faults, but you've got to think for its period, for its time, it was very, very advanced. And I don't think I'm open to be corrected, but I would like to know what has come along, which has even surpassed it. Yeah. And the sad thing is, you know, Po-Chi had to leave the country again because he wasn't offered loads of work over here. Certainly, in terms of, I can only talk for myself. In terms of, I wasn't offered loads of films to go on to. I did other work, but not necessarily off the back of Ping Pong, which you would normally expect in a sense. But I think that was down. But that's also down again to the cultural, the feedback you get from the Chinese community. You know, we are still not the community who pushes forward. The voice of the Chinese community is even today only just now more and more beginning to be heard as a voice. That was Po-Chi's voice in 1987. I'm happy to be corrected, but I think you can count on one hand or even 2 fingers how many other voices have come at that level in the UK up till the last 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, I mean that's very good moment for me to ask my second question, because I was kind of interested in, as you say, this was Po-Chi's voice. So he clearly has a particular experience that he's trying to represent. And I was just wondering, how would you characterise what he was trying to do with this film, and think about how successful do you think he actually was?
I mean, I think Po-Chi was very much the counter to the stereotypical caricature that I think, to a certain extent, unfortunately, is still rife today. That it's all Chinese takeaways and martial arts, you know, and that blatantly isn't true. I mean, I think there's a very complex and deeper truth to that, as David's pointed out, especially through the eyes of Elaine Choi, in terms of the fact that she classifies herself as somebody who's Chinese, who isn't really Chinese, who hasn't really thought about her heritage, to a certain extent, possibly because she doesn't have to. She's done, in some senses, the more traditional thing. She's gone into one of the professions that it is preferable for, because you know that you can actually create, you know, a good standard of living, i.e. law. And it's only when she's faced with having to sort of sort out the practicalities of a Chinese will, which by nature tend to be rather complex, is she drawn into this whole other side, which actually ends up being part of her, that she's never acknowledged. And I think there are an awful lot of British Chinese that are like that, who perhaps necessarily, by the nature of what they do, how they're brought up, they don't necessarily have to think beyond certain barriers, and that how much of that is because of the way they've been brought up, or the ease at which they may actually have to may find themselves in you know, sort of those 3 or 4 or 5 sort of selected professions. And the fact that, you know, sort of, I think until recently we are still experiencing the sort of the first stage of an immigrant family is that you look after your own, you look after your family, you provide for your family, and you don't have the time to worry about politics or socialising, or actually sort of really sort of integrating within the rest of society. I think it's now drawing out. So in terms of what Ping Pong done, it was literally years ahead of its time.
Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of actually being able to look at a whole community in that complex way, you know, sort of looking behind, you know, sort of the restaurant facade, and beyond what goes on in the kitchens and the woks, and actually at the people and the roots by way how they came here, you know.
Yeah,
sort of,
I mean, I thought that was also very interesting, the kind of diversity, because although you mentioned, David, it was autobiographical, you know, it's not just his story, there are so many different stories of different experiences going on. So, you know, Lucy, you've just been talking about Elaine's, but there are also different other stories.
Well, the thing is, because I was involved in a very early stage of production when it was all coming together, and I had a conversation with Po-Chi and Malcolm Craddock, the producer. And Po-Chi and Malcolm were great friends. They'd known each other because Malcolm Craddock's company used to make commercials. And I'm not sure whether Po-Chi actually made any commercials for him, but basically, as friends, they talked a lot, you know. And Po-Chi trained at the BBC, you know, like any young director. Like when I was a young actor, I left drama, you want to just do work. You don't want to do specific work about being British and Chinese. You just want to do work. But then things hit you, experiences hit you, life hits you. And I think he and Malcolm, over many years and many glasses of wine maybe, had talked about this. And then I think Malcolm had encouraged him. And I think we had a conversation about Chinese Detective in the sense that they'd both seen and had experience of now the Chinese Detective had happened. And so there was a possibility that there was an appetite for it. And so when so that's why that's how it came about. And I shouldn't say, I don't mean to say that it is totally autobiographical, but Po-Chi's in there, just as in my own project I'm in there, but it isn't all about myself. And as I say, I have to look at it now from the point of view as being a writer and an actor now, because it's totally different when you're just an actor, because you actually as an actor, you selfishly get hold of the script, you go, how many lines have I got, am I in this, am I in that, you know, blah 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 blah, and that's what you think about. Whereas when you've got another interest in it, and I also, as a writer, I don't think you sit there and go, now, what's the cultural relevances I've got to get into this scene, or how, you know, what's the thing in this? You write what you need to write. And from conversations I had with Po-Chi, there was this incredible frustration, which I know I've also felt. I'm sure Lucy has felt too. It's the frustrations. It's the barriers. You know, he's a good director. He had to leave. He trained the BBC, but there was only so far he could go. His own community would have a go at him because he doesn't speak Chinese. That I had the same feedback. I didn't come from a rich family. I came from a very poor family. So the only way I could go was up. But he had slightly more options. But those frustrations build up, and in a sense, when he came to write, when he came to put together Ping Pong, all those things suddenly need to be said. And he's done it. They've done it in an incredible way. It's a good story. And then the main core story, you know, of the actual the Wong family and Elaine and how she solves it is, I think, it's a fantastic story for a lot of the community in terms of how they deal with being Chinese from China, and how much they hold on to what they believe should be there. Because, you know, there's a great thing that communities who leave their own country tend to hold on to the experience more than the people back home. They move on because they're still trying to go, oh no, this is how it was, we must keep hold of this. And then there's the dilemma of those who were born here then. And at those times in the Chinese community, because I'd become quite well known because of the Chinese detective, I'd go and do things. I'd get invited by the Chinese community to go and do things, to talk, to open things, to, you know, blah, blah, blah. But they'd give me a hard time. They'd say, because Chinese people like that. How much are you married? How much do you earn? Blah, blah, blah. Why don't you speak Chinese? And first of all, I actually used to be quite knocked down by it. I apologize, blah, 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 blah. But eventually I got to the point where I said, look, you know, actually I don't speak Chinese. I would like to speak Chinese, but I don't. I'm British Chinese. And it's very important that the Chinese community in Britain learns to have a voice as British Chinese. And actually that's begun to happen, but it still hasn't happened. You know, we are fantastic academics, fantastic business people, but look in the House of Commons, look in the House of Lords, look in your local councils, look in Channel 4 BBC. You know, name me three directors who are earning a living. Name me 3 writers, 2 writers. I mean, you've got some young writers coming in tomorrow. I think this is tomorrow with the next session. But, you know, when it comes to having your own voice, the Chinese community in this country is still very reluctant. It's getting better. And Chinese Detective was not written by a Chinese, but God, the things it said were very close. When I think back now with my writer's head, but Ping Pong dropped a large ball in the water, and those ripples went out. Unfortunately, they didn't create as much stir as they should have done. But I think then later on, when people look back on it, and it's interesting because none of you have seen it, and Andy Willis, who's doing research on it, he kept ringing me saying, how do I see this film? They couldn't get a copy from the BFI, blah, blah, blah. We've talked about American copies. It's quite extraordinary, because, and it's so easy to happen, you know, because, and I do not mean this and I'm not, I promise you, I don't feel antagonistic about it, but it's so easy in a country like in the UK for this sort of stuff just to disappear, because it makes it has a sparkle, it has a light, and then it fades. And because it isn't picked up automatically or whatever, okay, and even the remembrance of it is sometimes forgotten. And that's why, to me, this sort of conference and get together is so important. It's been so important to do. And I've been amazed at some stuff I've been reading, and I want to come back, and not just because, you know, because it's fascinating. Because, you know, and I say tomorrow you've got, I think, Lab Kai Mo and Joe Ho is meant to be here today. I mean, Lucy writes herself, so I'll talk for herself. But it's important. Any of these new voices that we can encourage, the more the better. But again, they need to also be able to link up to this stuff. I mean, to me, I remember when we finished Ping Pong, and I said to Po-Chi, because I learned a hell of a lot from Po-Chi. I was quite an experienced actor by then, but actually he taught me so much, as he taught the others. As I said, he taught the others. I mean, we had one and only argument during the filming of this, because to be quite honest, I think I was a bit arrogant actually at the time, and there was a scene in the family home when he had to do stuff, and I was doing all his acting, and he kept saying to me, no, but you've got to, basically you're turning away from the camera, and I'm going, but I'm being real, I was going on about this, and he took me apart, he took me aside from everybody else for about 10 minutes, and he talked to me about camera reality. He said, you can act your tits off, but if the camera can't see it, then you might as well forget it. You're not on stage now. You're not on stage, And it was things like that. And he had this wonderful way, and he understood his art form. And I think this country lost a great talent, when he had to go off. Because he had to go off. There was nothing here for him. But hopefully, there will be now, or for others like him.
So this film was kind of very important in terms of bringing to light sort of these invisible stories that hadn't been told before. But also, Lucy, you mentioned sort of contesting stereotypes of, it's not just about takeaway sort of thing. And I just wondered, to what extent did Po-Chi have sort of complete autonomy in terms of how he chose to represent the experience of the Chinese in Britain? There was martial arts in the film, there were sort of nunchuckers, so there were kind of like glimpses of the kinds of things that we might usually expect, and I was wondering if that was an attempt to engage audiences.
But that's a very interesting point, you see. The fact is, stereotypical images are only bad when they're bad. The fact is, you can play a Chinese guy who has a very strong Chinese accent, but if he's a real person, like Robert there, it's fine, he's saying something very important, that's okay. You can have martial arts so long as it has a significance. It's when they just say, all right, this scene, a bunch of Chinese guys come running. It's a bit like the boxer guys, the guys who are playing boxing, and they just go in, and basically they're idiots. They're not, it doesn't mean anything. So, but you can have takeaway, you can have what seems to, you can have all the images that might seem stereotypical, but if they're played with honesty, they're played with truth, they are not. And that, I think what Po-Chi has, and is that, and what we all want when we're putting something together, is telling a truth. I mean, there's a fantastic play done called Takeaway. I don't think anyone ever saw it. It was set in a takeaway, and it was great. And the guys, how for the first time you got to understand what guys serving behind the counter, or people serving behind the counter, felt. And that was so important. But the fact it was in a takeaway was fantastic. It wasn't a stereotype.
Okay, so my last question before open to audiences. As you mentioned, David, you are working on a kind of Gold Mountain, which you're going to come back and speak about at one of our later sessions, and this is a kind of a play about your father's history as a seaman in the UK. And Lucy, you're also working on a documentary about transracial adoption, and this looks at Lucy's experience of being adopted into an English family in the 1960s, was it? 60s. And this is a story that's very close to my heart because my mother actually was born in the same orphanage as Lucy, so we kind of share this link. And Lucy's going to be showing a little clip about her documentary a bit later on today. But I kind of wanted to ask you what it was like to work in ping pong, sort of as people who've grown up Chinese in Britain and then have to perform sort of Chinese in Britain, and the extent to which you were allowed to, or you kind of drew on your own experience in kind of performing those roles.
I was very lucky in terms of ping pong. A, I was as green as they come. B, what was put in front of me was an excellent script, and it touched a real chord in the fact that it went to the nub of actually looking one way and being something else, and having people making we all make immediate snap judgments, but the immediate snap judgments that were being made by me were based on sort of what I classify now as basically antiquated and Victorian views about what an Oriental or a Chinese person should be. It doesn't exist. It belongs on the bookshelf. It was created, and basically has never gone away. and I can never live up to that ideal of what a Chinese person, female, should be when it comes to some casting directors or some people. They're looking for something that, as far as I'm concerned, doesn't exist. And in that area, that's a constant kind of like battle, which I don't think has ever gone away. I think sometimes it's better, sometimes it's worse. It depends what the project is. But doing Ping Pong, in some senses, was bittersweet in that it showed me what things could be. And on the reverse side of that, sometimes very early on, also showed me how far, as a community, an artistic community, as you know, the wider community, how far we still have to go. And in some senses, you know, sort of things have got better. They've sort of stepped back. They've gone 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. But I think things are getting there, and events like this, in some senses, retrospectively perhaps will have more of an impact now, because we are at a stage where, you know, that luxury of hindsight and actually being able to use the language that we have now of multicultural UK, perhaps we're in a better place to actually go forward and understand possibly what Po-Chi was trying to sort of convey sort of 30 years ago.
Well, this is, you know, kind of part of what Anne and I are trying to do, in a sense. It's kind of about recovering lost histories and kind of, you know, writing them back into history in that sense. So perhaps we can open questions to audiences. I'm sure there'll be many. Yes.
I just wanted to ask you a bit more about the aesthetics of the film and what the Chinese, if one can talk about them as a sort of as a holistic community and not the results of several migrations, but what the Chinese were watching, because I think it's quite interesting. I'm thinking laterally to Asian cinema, and at the same sort of time as Ping Pong, there was Honey Karashi and My Beautiful Laundrette. But in a way, I think it was only when Gurinder Chadha came in the 90s, with something like Barging on the Beach, that you got something which was trying to engage with what was a particular experience of all the different sorts of generations, for one thing, and migrations. But both of them, to some extent, borrow from an aesthetic which is coming from the Indian mainland, and at the time VHS was giving a whole alternative distribution network for people in the cities anyway, and I just wondered whether there was anything like that. I suppose a question for Po-Chi himself, but anyway, for you growing up.
I can't speak for Po-Chi, but I would imagine that there's a lot of influence, because he trained the BBC here, but also he went to Hong Kong, and he understood that obviously a film there you could just tell an everyday story in Hong Kong. People understood it. You know, do you know what I mean? It wasn't an unusual thing about a Chinese family, but it wasn't a special film. I think he brought that back. He brought a confidence, because I can't talk about where his influences are, but I just know that, and it goes back to the casting even. You see, Po-Chi cast every part in this film. As I say, 90% of the people in that film were not actors, but because he was able to speak to them in Chinese, for example, he could talk. I mean, the guy who plays Sam Wong, his name is K.C. Leong. No, he's no relation, and he happened to be the father of an actress who was in the film, and we had a real problem casting that part, because especially in the 80s, because he has to stay in a coffin most of the time, and it was so that people go, no bloody way am I gonna, you know, so unlucky, blah blah blah, and we were scratching our heads, and I said, well look, Susie's dad I believe he's doing a bit of extra work, and we had a word with him, and he loved it. He came in and did it. He eventually played my father in another thing I did as well. But Casey was fantastic. So it's things like that, and the way that Po-Chi whenever he cast these people was fantastic, because he was able to talk to them in their own, some of them in their own language. He had, the cultural references were there, and it made such a difference both in the casting and on the set. Because too often in casting, you're going to go on about, you're going to see later in the series, Soursweet. I don't want to take too much about it, but I have a real problem with Soursweet. in the sense that, you know, there was a fantastic novel, again, a voice for the community which slightly disappeared, and the director will come and talk about his own thing. But the point was, it was cast from the traditional way. It was run in a traditional way. And I've been to castings where I've even been told by a wonderful Caucasian person that actually I'm not really Chinese, because it's what we were saying. It's where they're coming from. You don't fit into the right box, and that's what Po-Chi didn't have the problem with, and that's why, you know, he managed through his talent and I think he's also a wonderful human being. He really is a really nice man. That he was able to draw out things from people which no one else would have bothered to have the time of day to do. Sorry, that hasn't answered your question. Maybe you can answer it. But it's
when you're sort of talking about the aesthetic, in what can you sort of maybe define that slightly more?
Well, I suppose, I mean, I was looking at the little, the sort of log line, if you like, of this part thriller, part romance, which is fascinating. You know, the Hanif Qureshi film, My Beautiful Laundrette, was, in a sense, it borrowed to some extent from Hindi cinema, in the sense that things are very exaggerated, the characters are very exaggerated. There's a kind of musicality almost in the way in which it's put together. It's not realism in the classic sense that
I see, yeah.
Person who'd grown up. And then Baji on the Beach takes that even further. So there are actual musical episodes.
I mean, I think you're probably right in that if now, in hindsight, and now that I have more experience, the one not criticism, but I think the one downside to Ping Pong was that it was not immediately pigeonholable from perhaps a Western point of view, a British point of view. And the fact that it was partly, you know, sort of partly comedy, partly sort of a slightly detective thing. There was a bit of romance in there. I think some people found it really difficult to actually say, what is this? And the love that we have, especially in this country, of actually saying, this is what it is, it goes in this hole, and it doesn't go any further. The interesting thing that you're mentioning about My Beautiful Laundrette is that I found out many, many years ago, and I was acting with Suad Faris. And we found out when we were on tour that Ping Pong and My Beautiful Laundrette had played back-to-back in the cinema in Canada for years. And that it was basically a sellout. And the guy who told us couldn't understand why those, well, specifically Ping Pong, hadn't done sort of the same thing for the British Chinese community that My Beautiful Laundrette had done for the Asian community. And also picking up on that, unfortunately, nobody sort of picked up the ball where Po-Chi left off in terms of the British Chinese community, and actually was able to ride that small sort of mini wave. I think, as David's pointed out, there are more people now from within the community who are beginning to write, who are beginning to find their own voice, that have concerns to do with the community, but not just the community, but how they feel within this society in terms of how we, as a community, actually fit together. And it's hopeful that we will start seeing plays and movies that address not just ethnic concerns, but society's concerns and how we, as part of that society, fit in.
Okay. Other questions? Yes.
Hi. Thank you, David and Lucy. I just have, I don't think I've formed my question fully yet, but you were talking just now about this reluctance in the British Chinese community to have a voice, or, I mean, it's changing now. But I was wondering, it just strikes me as British Chinese, it's kind of a hybrid kind of category in some sense. You have your Britishness, you have your Chineseness. So I'm wondering, when you say voice or representations that are more contemporary or that are more meaningful, that are no longer about martial arts, for example, this Orientalist stereotype. So what do you see as maybe the best practices? You know, how do we best address these stories? These how do we find these lost histories? What kind of stories are they? How much Britishness or Chineseness do you include? You know, what are those? How do you get this good commingling of these elements? Because it just strikes me as because British Chinese is at once a lived, a lived community and also imagined, because not everybody identifies themselves as British Chinese, or you can do that, but you could be originally from Taiwan, be from Hong Kong, be from China. So just community-wise, it's so diverse. So yeah, I guess I guess my main question here is, where do you see this progress? How do we go forward so that these stories can come out?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, it doesn't matter about the name British Chinese. In a sense, it can encompass anything. But where the stories come from, and this is really interesting, you see. Over my career, I've written 6 documentaries about the British Chinese in Liverpool, and I've talked and this and that. I've made a short film, and a number of times, you can, and I'm sure Rosa will reinforce this as well in terms of relationship. You can go and talk to friends, family, be introduced to families, and over a meal they'll tell you the most wonderful stories about their parents in China, or coming here, their dad on the ships, or whatever happened. They'll show you photographs and the blah blah blah. And then the moment you say, is there any chance I could film this or write this down, or or interview you saying it, the shutter comes right down. And I'll give you the perfect example of this in Gold Mountain, which is my piece. There's a piece of history about, and just after the war, during the Second World War, the Shanghainese seamen had a strike, and they struck because all the Chinese seamen were paid so badly, about a third of what the other seamen were made, and they also didn't get the thing called a war bonus, because these guys were going across the Atlantic on to convoys, and they weren't getting this war bonus, first of all. So the Shanghainese struck, and there's no doubt about it, the Chinese Communist Party were involved in this too. But they struck, and they didn't get parity, but they got improved rates and everything else. In 1945, not long after the war ended, and the documentation is now online, you can see it. Basically, the government made a decision that these guys had to go. They were terrified that with a Labour government in and everything else, they were terrified about communists being around. So basically, they shipped them off, literally in about a week. They put a ship there, and literally, they first of all said, here's a ship, go get on it, and those who didn't, they usually took from their homes. So a lot of wives and children were just left without a father. Now, I tell you this because this isn't well now. In 2012, I only knew this story about 5 years ago. I was working on a script with a friend of mine in Liverpool, and he sent me a documentary made by Granada about this, and I go, wow, it's amazing. Then I heard a Radio 4 documentary about it, and I was standing in my kitchen, and I was so angry. I think, how can this be possible? How can all this happen? And why don't I know about this? And I got a call the next day from a woman called Yvonne Foley, who's half Chinese, and she was a daughter of one of these seamen. And to cut a long story short, it's now coming out. But I went back. I said, I've made 6 documentaries. So I went back, after this happened, I went back to Liverpool, and I talked to some of the people I talked to and had, got information from. And I said to them, why did you never mention this to me? And they said, you never asked. And that's extraordinary. See, so where does the source come? It comes from within us all. It's being able to say, my granny did this and my granddad did that. It's actually opening up this chest. I mean, it took me 20 years to be able to expose what I had to say about my father and everything else. So I'm not, I'm an actor, So I'm not blaming anyone. It's not a matter of blame, but it's actually going back to all our families and saying, these are our stories. Whether you're a writer, or pass them on to somebody else. Tell your grandchildren where you came from, where great granny came from, or great granddad came from. Tell them the troubles that they had, why they left. I was researching why my father left China, blah blah blah, blah blah blah, and it's important. And the nice thing is, people have come to see Gold Mountain from the Chinese community all over, and they're beginning to say, maybe I can talk about this now. Maybe I can turn it into a bit of dance or a bit of this and that. So to answer your question very simply, that's where it comes from. That's where the voice is. It's not such a different voice. I mean, I can't speak Chinese, so I have to speak the way I speak. I'm an actor. I have to interpret it the way I have chosen my path to go along. someone else will do it differently. But the point is, it's actually not being afraid anymore to speak about it. In this country, particularly, the whole idea of being opium, and that was interesting what we said before. Opium has been a great, huge burden on the Chinese community's shoulders, because somehow the British did a great trick, pouring it into China and making us use it. Then suddenly we become the great evil doers of opium, and while opium was taken by the middle upper classes, the aristocrats, it was fine. The moment the Chinese coolies and everyone else started using it, suddenly this terrible drug, and we're going to have white slavery and all this. And my father was an opium addict from the age of 12. He became a seaman, and it's important to me to understand why these things happen. It's important for a non-Chinese audience in this country and other places to understand the effects that they had on that. Opium was an easy way of existing when you had very little. And the Chinese seamen were paid so poorly, their conditions were so thin. Now, to be fair, not every Chinese seaman took opium. My dad did, and when he was in Liverpool, he sold opium because they looked after each other. It wasn't like being a drug dealer on the corner now selling crack cocaine. It was a social service in a way. It was like a pharmacy. It was because these guys had to get it from somewhere, and what they were doing, they were saving what little money they had because they wanted to send it home, and it's an incredible vicious circle in a way. No, it's my father made his choices. Other guys didn't go along his path, and we know the success of the Chinese community, but we've allowed ourselves, and still do, to be crushed by a lot of history, which we shouldn't be crushed by. And the more we speak about it, the more we explore it. Things like this, it's fantastic. It frees you. And I promise you, the moment I wrote about my father and his opium addiction and his gambling and everything else, I felt, my respect for my father rose as well. Not because I think he was a great man. He wasn't. He was a terrible man in his own way. But he's my father. And I understood I understood as a human being where he came from. And it's just understanding that, it's the stereotype. Why I hate the stereotype, it has nothing in it. It's a bubble. It's a lazy bubble. It doesn't tell you anything about the person or reasons why they do X, Y, and Z. And they can be doing martial arts, cooking, whatever you like. They can be an opium dealer, but if you tell a story about that person, then there's a reward at the end. There's an understanding. It's an education. Now, art obviously isn't there to possibly, unlike here, it's not an educational facility. But also, I believe as an artist, as an audience, and as a performer, when you come to an event, whether it's a film or it's a play or a radio, there's a sharing. I'm giving you information in my way, and you receive it. But also, I receive from you the way you react to it. And as I say, now, and I can't remember the audiences in Ping Pong really being full of Chinese people. We had special showings, I know that, but certainly from the play Gold Mountain, one-to-one, seeing people's reactions. And I've had people cry. We've had people crying in the audience because they've been children of these seamen, and for the first time they say we're now able to recognize and say that my dad was one of those seamen. And that's so important. Now what will come out of that, I don't know. Maybe their grandchildren will say something, but that's where the stories come from.
So Lucy, how would you respond to this? Because you're in a sense in the midst of this kind of challenge at the moment with the making of your documentary.
I think it's right. Picking up from what David said, it's actually having the courage, and it's taken me 30 years to kind of think, I must have a go. And it is giving context and picking up one context, actually giving a circumstance true context. In terms of my own personal background, I was transracially adopted. In the sort of early 60s, I was part of a specific program which was seeking to place Chinese foundlings and orphans with homes in the UK. And just looking at that, and I sort of did a sort of a fictionalized version of that in a one-woman play. And actually thinking about that, it's an extraordinary thing to do in terms of the fact that we were all literally shipped over to the UK and literally handed over to our prospective families. They hadn't seen us before. We just arrived on the coattails of these BOAC, which is British Airways now, hostesses who said that they would accompany these children, and we were handed over. And there was this immense amount of kind of like information and pictures of myself and other people in these little red happy coats and being handed over to our prospective parents. And it's an extraordinary thing. And it's a very contentious issue, both for, you know, sort of the Caucasian community and also for the Chinese community, given the fact that that was born out of an immense period in Hong Kong of deep privation because of immigration and the Great Leap Forward, and the fact that they were running out of, literally had run out of space in which to house these children who were being abandoned because, and they were being abandoned, and it's called in order to be found, because they wanted somebody to find them, because they couldn't take care of them. And actually sort of writing a short piece about that and also going on to do the documentary, it's very freeing, not only for myself but for other Hong Kong adoptees that I've met from the same home as me, to actually be able to sit down and they are now, some of them getting to the stage where they feel that they can talk about the dichotomy that they had, being brought up in pre-multicultural UK, probably the only kind of like foreign influence where they were brought up, and the conflict in identity that they have is now only beginning to be explored and talked about. So it is, yes, these are where the stories are going to come from. These are where the springboards for hopefully other people who are interested in that sort of, you know, part of our society will come from, and open up the debates. And I believe that, you know, as a theatre practitioner, the reason I do it, yes, it's entertainment, but it's to open up a dialogue, is to actually offer something to the audience. Whether the audience does anything about it or not is neither here nor there, but you are offering something for, you know, sort of, even if it's only purely for entertainment, but all for, hopefully for discussion, which will go on to bigger and better things.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, one more before we have to wind up for lunch. Rosa.
I was just interested in what you're saying, because obviously there are the stories out there, and you know, like you said, there are British Chinese filmmakers writing stories, trying to produce stories. But I was just interested in what you were saying, that when you then go to financiers and talk about the projects, the shutters come down. Why do you think that is with the Chinese community?
I think it's fear.
For Chinese stories, I should say.
I still think it's fear. I mean, it's bred from, it comes from the parents. I mean, the one thing I still carry, and it's liberating now, but it's, you know, my father constantly said to us as children, we must never speak about the family to strangers. So, you know, strangers come, must never speak about the family, and it gets into your brain. Now, I'm hoping, I mean, you know, you're a filmmaker, you're a writer, I mean, it's still there, it can't help it, but it's a generational thing, you know, I'm 60 now. I mean, hopefully the young, you know, next generation, that gets less and less. But the more they see, the better, you know, once they see something. Or even role models, you know, the fact is, in British television today, you name me one or two role models from the Chinese community in mainstream, I'm talking about from British television now, on British television or in the media or whatever. They're very, I can't think of any at the moment. I think there might be a few news readers, but, and you know, that's, children, young people need to see those role models, which allows them then to feel, oh yes, I could maybe do that. I have ambitions to do that, or, you know, to tell my story or whatever.
Oh, sorry, I thought you meant the shutters came down in terms of finances and producers when you go to the...
Oh, well, actually I wasn't, well, there's that too. I mean, there's that too. I mean, there's that too. I mean, you know, if you came up with a modern day version of ping pong, would they be open their arms? It's very difficult. I would think very difficult to say. You know about financing. Financing is very difficult. Yeah. But if you had a lot of kung fu in it, or a big star, or something like that, and blah blah blah, you know, it's interesting, isn't it? Because Morgan Freeman, who I think is a fantastic actor, he can play Robin Hood's gang in a Hollywood movie over here. You know, it's very difficult to do that kind of casting generally. All right.
Lucy, would you like to respond?
No, I think David said it.
Sorry.
Okay, well, why don't we, as you know, you were both saying about continuing the dialogue, why don't we go for lunch and we can mingle and all,
All right.
you know, chat
Thanks
over.
very much.
Thank you.